No. The answer is no. No, no. The title of this video is called Was Watchmen Really That Bad? No, it wasn't even bad. It wasn't close to bad. This movie introduced me to a whole franchise I didn't know. I didn't know anything about Watchmen until I saw this movie. I was introduced to the trailer when I saw The Dark Knight when it was first released. Man, that's something. What a time that was when The Dark Knight came out. Amazing movie. But I was introduced to the first trailer. The trailer had me hooked. It hooked me. I was like, what is this? Like, what in the world? And as a person who didn't know the comic, because I went in this movie, I didn't want to read anything because I knew about the comic after I saw the trailer. Didn't want to read it. I wanted to go in blind, not blind, but fresh. And as a movie, as a whole, not knowing the comic, this movie was a masterpiece. Acting, directing, music, everything. Shout out to Zack Snyder. To me, I know people say 300. To me, this is Zack Snyder's best work. 300 is amazing. 300 is amazing. In my opinion, Watchmen is his best work. One of the best superhero movies of all time. DC, Marvel, whatever. Watchmen is a work of art. Granted, some stuff, now that I know the comic, and it's been a while since this came out. Granted, excuse me, this movie was missing some things that the comic book showed. But what comic book movie doesn't have that? I mean, well, yeah, there's a lot of stories that took something from the comic but didn't show everything. And personally for me, what was not shown did not mess up anything. You know what I'm saying? Now, one thing I do love, I ain't gonna reach for it. I love the comic movie animation they did last year, the part 1 and part 2 of Watchmen, where they showed the whole comic and the Black Sails one and put it all together. I love how they did that, but I'm talking about this live action movie. And I have the Ultimate Edition, but it was like 3.5 hours long. This movie is a masterpiece. It was just ahead of its time. I don't think people was ready for this. I really don't. It was ahead of its time. It's funny how you hear people talk about how great this movie is now. Because I remember when it first came out, it was getting a lot of flack. And I'm like, I mean, everybody has their opinion. But I'm like, this is cinema, bro. I don't have one bad thing to say about this movie. And usually I do. You know, I guess the one thing I could say is they didn't have to have such a, I don't think the sex scene was necessary. But outside of that, I can look past that. Outside of that, there was really nothing. There was nothing I could say wrong about it. It hit the heart on a lot of things. Rorschach made some good points. The comedian, other thing, like it hit home, bro, on some personal level stuff. And I guess that's why we love it so much. Thinking about it is and anybody knows me, when you have a project and it hits home for me personally, it does something to me where I put it at a higher level. But even outside of that, just as a movie, a film, it was ahead of its time. I want to see what the critical drinker think. I thought I reacted to this, but then I realized I didn't. But the critical drinker has a title that says it was made 4 years ago. Was it really that bad? I want to see what he thinks. I'll put the original video in the description below. But yeah, shout out to the critical drinker. I'll put it the original one in the description below. But I'm interested in seeing what he says. Because my answer is no. It was a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece. Point blank, period. But let's see what he says.
Oh, it's you again. Well, since you're here, allow me to regale you with another story from the annals of cinema history. When it comes to controversial movie directors that are still working today, it's tough to think of one more divisive and contentious than Zack Snyder.
I think Zack gets a lot of flack for no reason. Too much flack. Too much hate.
Usher in a unique new cinematic style for comic.
Not saying his movies are top tier all the time. Like Rebel Moon is mid, is overhated in my opinion. But even before that, like, come on, man. Zack Snyder makes some gems, bro. I'm not saying every movie he's made is great, but I think he just overhated. I'll just leave it at that.
adaptations, or a talentless, overrated hack whose movies look like they were shot in the middle of a power cut. Whereas the iconic shots of 300 really put him on the map, the grim, somber, and depressing tone of Man of Steel and Batman vs.
I love that movie. I don't care what
Superman
anybody
knocked
says.
Him off it.
If
But
the only
there's
fault
another Zack
that movie
Snyder
had was it
that's
didn't
a
show
bit
a lot
more
of
difficult
Batman.
to categorize. A
Batman and
movie
Superman
that dared
action.
to
That was
tackle
it.
source material so challenging that it frustrated
Wait, what?
some of the. But there's another Zack Snyder movie that's a bit more difficult to categorize. A movie that dared to tackle source material so challenging that it frustrated some of the best writers and producers in Hollywood for decades. A movie named Watchmen. Based off the
Masterpiece.
labyrinthine and extremely mature comic book series, Watchmen tells the story of a group of former crime fighters living in an alternate 1980s America, poised on the brink of nuclear war. With a cast of flawed, morally questionable characters doing distinctly unheroic things to reach their goal, it dared to ask the question, if superheroes could exist, would you really want them to? Watchmen copped a lot of shit when it came out back in 2009.
For no
Fans
reason.
of the
Good
original
reason.
comic series were somehow surprised that a 2.5-hour movie wasn't able to incorporate every single element from the 450-page graphic novel.
Right. I mean, it can't.
Oh shit.
General audiences,
That would
on
have
the
been
other
a
hand,
heck of a
went
long
into
movie.
theaters expecting a fun, action-packed superhero.
Yeah, that's a
flick
lot of
about
people's
bunch
fault too. Not every superhero movie where superheroes in with costume is not going to be the Avengers or Justice League. It's not. When you watch V for Vendetta, that's a whole different type. When you watch Watchmen, it's different. And so, yeah, I think that's a fault too, is that people came in expecting something else. This is not the Avengers.
The good guys out to save the world, and well, that's not exactly what they got.
Nah. You're stuck in here with me.
As a result, Watchmen failed to generate enough momentum to break through at the box office. Combined
Sad.
with lukewarm reviews from journalists, remember when people still cared what they thought? It gained a reputation as a bit of
A
a
great
critical
opening
and
to a
commercial
movie, too.
failure. But was it really?
No.
Well, it's not like I can go back and fudge the box office numbers. What do you think I am, Disney? But I can take a closer look at Watchmen as a creative endeavour and try to answer the age-old question, was it really that bad? Now, the theatrical cut is over 2.5 hours long, so needless to say, the story is a bit of a fucking monster, and if I tried to break down every single plot point, then this review would probably end up longer
Yeah.
than Mahler's TFA
The Ultimate Edition, the
series.
one I got, is 3.5 hours.
But I'll do my best to give you a decent overview of the story. So let's begin, shall we? Watchmen takes place in an alternate 1985 America, where masked crime fighters have been around since the 1940s. At least they were, until they got outlawed a few years earlier after a wave of public backlash. Now the few that remain have either retired to live out their lives as normal people, become government agents, or ignored the ban and continued to operate outside the law. Meanwhile, the accidental creation of a godlike being known as Dr. Manhattan has allowed Richard Nixon to win the Vietnam War and a third term in office, not to mention shifting the balance of the Cold War in favour of America. Backed into a corner, the Soviets are becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable, pushing the world to the brink of Armageddon. The main storyline kicks off with the murder of an elderly crime fighter known as the
Unforgettable.
Comedian,
I love how they
which
played that
attracts
song in the
attention of his
intro.
former comrade Rorschach, named because of the inkblot mask that he wears to hide his identity. Believing that former members of the Watchmen crime fighting group are being targeted for assassination, Rorschach tries to contact the others and warn them. This is where we get to meet the other main characters of the story. There's Night Owl, who used to be a Batman type character with a badass suit and a hoverjet, but now he's fat and retired and kind of a pussy. Ozymandias, on the other hand, has used his
I loved his
scientific
role.
genius to become a billionaire tech giant, hoping to use science to avert a nuclear war. Then there's Dr. Manhattan himself, who now works as an agent
The
of the US
soundtrack
government,
for this,
along
the
with
score?
his girlfriend Silver
Oh my
Spectre.
goodness, top
Manhattan's
tier.
abilities allow him to experience the universe outside of linear time, meaning that his mind basically exists in the past, present, and future all at once. As you can probably imagine, this makes it pretty hard for him to focus on little things like the outcome of the Cold War, and there's a growing rumour that he may actually be a threat to humanity. This all comes to a head during a disastrous TV interview where he tries to reassure the public, only to be confronted by a former lover that claims he gave her a terminal illness for some downtime. But with America's ultimate weapon missing in action, the Soviets used the opportunity to invade Afghanistan, bringing the world even closer to World War III. Meanwhile, just as Rorschach's getting closer to the truth of the comedian's death, he's framed for the murder of a former supervillain and sent to prison for it. Knowing he'll be dead within hours if they don't do something, Night Owl and Silk Spectre are forced to come out of retirement to rescue him. That's the three basic strands to Watchmen's story. The first follows the growing relationship between Night Owl and Silk Spectre as they dust off their capes and costumes for the first time in years. The second follows Rorschach's search for the truth and his growing suspicion that there's a much bigger conspiracy at work. And the third centres on Dr. Manhattan, trying to decide whether humanity even deserves to be saved. In between all this, we get flashbacks to the defining events of each character's life over the previous decades, most of which centre around the comedian and his gradual transformation from honourable crime fighter to bloodthirsty warrior to cynical and embittered old man. He's like the bridge that spans the different generations of superheroes, from the innocent optimism of the 1940s to the turbulence and disillusionment of the 70s, and finally to the grim foreboding of the 80s, where there are no heroes anymore, and the world stands
as the
on
comedian
the brink of
was, he was right on a lot of
with
things.
nobody left to pull it back. He also gets one of the best lines in the entire movie.
What happened to the American dream?
That scene.
What happened to the American dream? It came true.
You're looking.
You're looking at it.
One of the best things in movie
history. As the main characters eventually
history.
join forces to uncover the truth, they learn that the comedian's death was part of something much bigger and more sinister than a simple assassination, and that one of their own may in fact be working against them. And with the doomsday clock ticking down to midnight, they discover that the price of saving the world could be higher than any of them ever imagined. Now, when I think about Watchmen's relative failure at the box office, I can't shake the feeling that it was, at heart, a badly marketed film. Anyone who went into this movie expecting a traditional, upbeat comic book flick where the hero defeats the bad guy and saves the world is going to come away from Watchmen feeling pretty disappointed. It's simply not that kind of movie because it was never meant to be. Look beneath the flashy visuals, and Watchmen is a complex film that explores interesting aspects of the superhero genre. I'm kind of hesitant to use the word deconstruction because these days it conjures up images of angry, purple-haired land whales that think their gender studies degree is a magical key to unlock the mysteries of complex storytelling. But in this case, it really is the best way to describe what Watchmen does. It's a movie that's not afraid to challenge our conventions and assumptions about superheroes. It tells a complex, multi-layered story spanning decades, with characters that represent vastly differing ideas and worldviews. And it does this in a patient, detailed, and methodical way.
I was gonna say, you gotta give credit to the fact that they put so much of that book. They was able to fit a lot of it in 2.5 hours. And if you have the Ultimate Edition, I have the Ultimate Edition, it's 3.5 hours. They was able to fit a lot and do it well. It didn't seem out of place, and it didn't seem rushed or just taking too long, which you can't do that with this kind of movie. But they did it well. You got to give them credit for it.
The groundwork for the big emotional payoffs that come later. It takes the time to build up the history of its world. And
personally, I like they did it that way instead of the monster.
Giving us big, elaborate flashbacks to previous groups and events, whose connection to the main story only becomes clear much later. Like seeing a young version of the comedian trying to first Silk Spectre back in the 1940s. A scene like this might seem like a pointless detour into self-indulgent territory until you realise that not only does it establish the darker side of the comedian's personality, but it also gets put into an entirely different context later when you find out that Silk Spectre actually fell in love with him despite his flaws, even having a child with him. A child whose unlikely conception ultimately helps Dr. Manhattan to rediscover his humanity. Just like a watch mechanism, even the smallest piece has a role to play. Every scene and flashback sheds a bit more light on the events that brought us here, providing insight into the film's cast of flawed, morally ambiguous characters. And this is another aspect of Watchmen that I really have to give the movie credit for. Most of Watchmen's characters are neither good nor bad. They all act according to their own worldview, and whether or not you consider them heroes or villains depends very much on your own perspective.
There was no friendly neighborhood
Rorschach,
Spider-Man.
for example, is a violent vigilante operating outside the law, ruthlessly pursuing his investigation with no regard for anyone caught in his path. He's extremely conservative in his view of the world, openly despising liberals, homosexuals, prostitutes, drug users, or anyone who strays off a righteous path. He's a man of deep principle and conviction, moulded by a harsh and unforgiving life, and he sees the world purely in terms of right and wrong, black and white, if you will. Compared to the others, he's not particularly big or physically strong. He's not super smart and he doesn't have any powers or gadgets. He's just a tough, tenacious little bastard, ready and willing to take on guys twice his size without any fear or hesitation, ready to fight dirty and use any advantage he can find. Like when this guy tries to confront him in prison. Doesn't end too well for him though. Rorschach is a man who lives by a strict moral code and won't break it for any reason, even at the cost of personal friendships or his own life. He
that scene hit me hard.
unbending willpower.
When you don't know the
and his
story,
philosophy
you didn't
is
expect that
perfectly
ending.
Summed up in this line.
Never compromise.
Not
Even in the face of Armageddon.
At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the comedian, who has no real morals or principles to live by. He treats everyone around him like shit, openly abuses his powers, and seems resigned to the looming threat of nuclear war. But at one point, confronted by the truth of what's about to happen, he breaks down and acknowledges his own failings and mistakes. He's an old man now, brooding over a wasted life. Dr. Manhattan, on the other hand, is so disconnected from the world that he sees the survival of humanity as a simple intellectual problem, rather than something he actually cares about on a deeper level. Like in this flashback, when the comedian guns down a pregnant woman who attacks him, only to point out that Dr. Manhattan could have prevented the whole thing if he wanted. Instead, he chose to do nothing. That says a lot about where his head's at.
God,
ultimately, the character is there to pose an interesting question. If you give a man the powers of a god, what will that actually do to his humanity? Night Owl and Silk Spectre round out the main cast, and for what it's worth, they're probably the most well-adjusted of the bunch. Both are retired at the start of the movie. One's living a life of luxury and privilege as the girlfriend of Dr. Manhattan. The other is a timid, overweight bookworm who spends his days reminiscing with the first owner of the Night Owl name. But both of them are frustrated and unfulfilled because their lives lack purpose and meaning now. A dinner date quickly turns somber as they realise there really isn't much to look forward to anymore. It's only when they're forced to suit up again that they start to come alive, and the adrenaline rush of beating the shit out of some criminals reignites their physical relationship. And you're left to wonder, are they really doing this for the right reasons, or are they just two aging crime fighters trying to recapture their glory days? On that subject, one of the threads running through this movie is the idea of youthful idealism gradually giving way to cynicism and disenchantment as characters are forced to make way for the next generation. Like the first Silk Spectre, who becomes an embittered drunk, yearning for her younger days. Or Dr. Manhattan's former girlfriend, who he literally traded in for a younger model. Or even the first Night Owl, who wrote a scathing autobiography exposing the darker side of masked crime fighters.
That was a hard scene, bro.
Watchmen doesn't just ask questions about what happens when flawed and unworthy people are given the mantle of hero. It also explores what becomes of those people when they have to hang up their capes for the last time, facing up to their autumn years in the knowledge that their best days are long behind them. But the biggest and most interesting revelations are saved for the finale, when our heroes converge on the enemy stronghold to confront the movie's villain at the 11th hour and foil his plans for world domination. Except, this particular villain isn't out to dominate the world, he's out to save it. And there's no chance of foiling his plans here. There's no last second reprieve like we've seen a million times before.
Yeah, I've never seen an ending like that before in
he's already
superhero
put his
movies.
plan into action, and even Dr. Manhattan's intervention isn't enough to stop him. It's a scene that's both surprising and refreshing, and you're left to wonder
it was like,
what
wow,
the hell
wow.
happens next.
I remember kept
Just
saying
like
wow
Thanos
over and
a
over
decade
again.
later, Ozymandias can be seen as the tragic anti-hero of Watchmen's story. A smart, logical, pragmatic man forced to do the unthinkable to save the world from total destruction, sacrificing millions of innocent lives in order to save billions more, and uniting the entire world against a common enemy by framing Dr. Manhattan for the whole thing. Peace founded on a dark lie, but peace all the same. The question is it enough?
That's why I love Rorschach, because no, that's not the way to do it.
Even the heroes come to recognize the wisdom of his plan.
You understand, don't you?
Without condoning or condemning.
Man, it's nice to see Ozymandias being treated with respect and reverence here, instead of turned into the butt of a fucking unfunny joke.
Oh yeah, I can't stand that show. Oh my goodness, that was an embarrassment. That actually won awards. That's why I tell you I don't take award shows seriously.
Lindelof, you useless
I don't take
hack.
Grammys,
It's
Oscar, whatever. I don't take them
to
seriously.
The overarching threat of annihilation that perfectly encapsulates everything this movie's been trying to say. That in the real world, there are no easy, comfortable answers. There are no clear heroes and villains. No simple choice between right and wrong. There are just people, flawed and weak and human, trying to make the best choices they can. And this for me is what makes Watchmen such a clever, complex, satisfying movie. It doesn't provide easy answers or neat resolutions, but instead it asks difficult questions
it makes
that
you
lesser
think.
movies would have shied away from. What does a man lose if he gains the power of a god? How do people control their darker impulses when they've been freed from responsibility? And are humans only capable of working together when they have a common enemy to strive against? These are interesting questions, and I'm glad the movie had the balls to ask them. It's not all perfect, of course. While the grim, dark, foreboding atmosphere of the comic is perfectly conveyed here, and it's clear that some shots were literally taken right off the page, the endless rain and gloom can be kind of monotonous at times.
It worked perfectly for me.
Nuclear war references
With
are
a story
bit on
like
the
this, it
nose.
worked perfectly for me.
Do we really need to hear 99 red balloons playing twice? Does everything need to reference the blood-covered smiley face pointing at 5 to midnight on the doomsday clock? The movie also omits a lot of details and subplots from the graphic novel, for obvious reasons. If you're trying to condense a 450-page story into about 150 pages of actual script, then clearly some stuff needs to
be left out.
The Ultimate Edition actually fixes many of these issues, and it even adds in the Tales of the Black Freighter content.
Yes,
but the
which I
result is a
would
movie-
advise. Last year, the animation movies, it was chapter 1 and 2, they fit all that in one. I like how they did that. I would advise getting those chapter 1 and 2. The way they put both those stories into that one, it was very well done. That was comically accurate. You know, if you want comically accurate, go to the animation movies. Both of them are good.
That's well over 3 hours long. It's up to you if you consider that a worthy trade-off. Long, grim, and dark it might be, but I think Watchmen does a pretty decent job of capturing the essence of the comic, getting across the same ideas, even if it does it in a more streamlined way. And I'm just gonna say it, this is the kind of movie that Zack Snyder was born to direct.
Yes.
Why they thought he was the right guy to do a Superman flick is beyond me.
Well,
But
no, I still
Watchmen
like
is
Man of Steel.
well
He did
within
Man
his
of Steel right.
directorial
I don't care what
comfort
anybody
zone,
say.
and it shows.
Man of
Overall,
Steel
then,
is a
while
classic.
it may not be to everyone's taste, I genuinely think Watchmen is a decent stab at bringing some pretty challenging source material to the big screen.
And it was different.
It's a
It
movie
brought
that's
some
not
flavor
afraid
to
give us
cinema.
a complex, morally grey, thought-provoking story with equally complex characters, delivering on both style and substance. And for that reason, it gets a solid recommendation from the drinker. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
So yeah, glad he liked it. But regardless, ain't gonna change my opinion. This was a masterpiece. And I do disagree about Man of Steel. Man of Steel is a classic. Man of Steel is a classic. But yeah, watch it for yourselves. If you watched it already, watch it again. Watch it again. But I would also advise the animation movies. I think they did a really good job. But Watchmen will always be peak cinema. Just peak cinema. I was about to say one of the best superhero movies, but not even just superhero movies, just movies, period. You know, in a movie in the superhero world, it's top 5. It's up there in the top 5. I have to think about what those 5 are, but I would say that it's on the Mount Rushmore of best movies, superhero movies. I will say that Watchmen is, for me, in my opinion. Excuse me, in my opinion. But let me know how you feel about it. Anyway, thank y'all so much for tuning in. I'll put the original video description below. And yeah, I'll see y'all later. Take care.